And on to chapter 15. Chapter 15 is a pretty interesting chapter, another one that's got a lot of controversy surrounding it, but only if you are religious. So this is moving into Darwin and the theory of evolution. So this one is a little more widely known because it has been covered a lot in lower grade levels. So the history of evolution, thought, Darwin's theory of natural selection, and evidence for evolution. So before Darwin, the idea was that, well, there were several different views, but it was a lot of religious kind of aspect that life was created by nature was determined by deep-seated belief held by intractable truths rather than by experimentation and observation, and it really was kind of more of a religious aspect of that. Biologists have slowly begun to accept various ideas of evolution. Species change through time, and that's what evolution is, change over time. Evolution is the unifying principle of biology, and this is the idea that life did come from one individual or one original organism. And so what I always tell all my students when we begin an evolution topic is that I'm not going to tell you what to believe. Your beliefs are your own. But even if you believe something different, that's totally fine. I'm going to teach you what science supports, and this is what science supports. And even if you don't believe it, it's still good to learn the other side of it. So if you don't believe it, that's perfectly fine. But it's good to know the other side of it, and that's what this is. So there's a lot of evidence that does support this, and we will go over some of that as well. So similarities between living things reflect that there was a common ancestor at one point in history, and that all the living organisms evolved from that common ancestor at some point. And dissimilarities between living things reflect ancient or common ancestry that have changed over time. So taxonomy matured during the mid-18th century. Count Buffon was a French naturalist. He wrote a 44-volume catalog of all known plants and animals. And he provided evidence of evolution and suggested the mechanisms, including environmental influences and the struggle for existence. Then there was this guy named Linnaeus, and Linnaeus, he really started putting things in order. And Carlos Linnaeus, he was kind of the founder of the organization of taxonomy, and taxonomy is the classification of organisms, and he believed in the putting things into groups, and he had kind of the basic structure down, and we still build off of his basic structure of kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, only we've added to it. Now there's domains that go above kingdoms, and now there are subspecies and superphylums and subphylums and things like that. So we've kind of added on to that original ones that he created. Looking at a species, because that's what we overall deal with, an ideal structure and function, and a species in general is something that can breed to produce fertile offspring. So a species would be like a dog. All dogs are the same species because you can breed different types of dogs together and get a mutt. And then mutts can still breed together and make other mutts. So those are examples of a type of species. Now, an example of different kinds of species to different species would be a donkey and a horse. If you breed a donkey and a horse together, you get a mule. Two mules would breed together. They do not make another mule because mules are sterile. The only way you can get a mule is breeding a donkey and a horse. That's the only way you can get a mule. So the only way to get a mule is a donkey and a horse, because a donkey is one species and a horse is another species. They're so different genetically that they cannot make a fertile offspring. So those are examples of different species. So Carlos Linnaeus was the one that kind of created this idea of a classification system. So Cuvier was the first to use comparative anatomy to develop the system of classifying organisms. He was the one that kind of founded this paleontology. Paleontology is like the study of past life. and he proposed catastrophism, um, which uses catastrophes in the past has caused Earth stratas to have a new mix of fossils. After each catastrophe, the region was repopulated by species from the surrounding areas. So something happened, like a flood or fire, and killed off the organisms in that particular area. And then the organisms that were surrounding that area kind of moved in and filled in the gaps. And then they were able to repopulate that. The results of catastrophes has caused changing in appearances over time. Then we get these guys named Lamarck, Lyell, and Malthus. These are more of the bigger names that you're going to see in evolution. So Lamarck was the first biologist to propose evolution. He had an idea that was getting close but still kind of off the mark. Lamarck's idea was that organisms used something over time, and the more they used it, the more they developed it, the more that they were able to use that and pass that on. So giraffe necks is a great example for him. A giraffe wanted to reach a tall branch, and so he stretched out his neck, and that stretched neck was passed on to the offspring. The problem with this is it didn't have to do with genetics. Now we know that genetics and genes and DNA, that is what is actually passed on to the offspring. So that's where he faltered. Sorry, pets are chasing each other. That's where he faltered, was that he didn't know anything about genetics, and his theory didn't include genetics. So an example would be like, say, you decided you wanted to work out and you wanted to get extra buff and extra muscular. And so in theory, you would have a child and your child would be extra buff. It doesn't happen that way because it's not in the genetics. And so that's where Lamarck's hypothesis went wrong. Now then we have this guy named Lyell. Lyell said the earth is subject to slow but continuous cycles of erosion and uplifting. He proposed uniformitarianism, which states that the rate and process of change are constant. So his is more of a earth-changing kind of thing. And his ideas showed that the earth is changing at a certain rate and that these rates are constant. Malthus was he was the one that was looking at like human populations, and he said that populations cannot grow without balances to keep them in check. And there are things to keep populations in check, such as famines or wars or limitations that prevent populations from growing beyond what they can handle. And this has proven to be true in nature to an extent. The only exception to this rule really is humans. Humans are the only ones that are really growing beyond what the population can handle. And that's because we always find ways to solve that problem. If there's a disease like COVID, we find a vaccine to help with that, or we have masks or gloves or rules in place that help to mitigate that. But if a child is born premature, then we have technology to help with that. So we are the only ones that break that rule. If there is a famine, then we find a way to get food to that area. Whereas with other animals, if there is lack of food, then the animal dies. If there is a disease, it wipes the animal out. So Malthus's idea was that there are checks and balances that keep a population under control. So here is an example of Lamarck's idea that an animal uses its traits and that trait is passed on. So the animal stretches its neck, and because it has used that trait, then it has passed on. Now Darwin's is a little bit different. Darwin says that there are random variations in a population. So mutations in the population cause some animals to naturally be taller than others. And so then ones that are naturally taller are going to be the ones that survive, and the ones that are shorter are going to be the ones that die off. And so the ones that are naturally taller are just naturally better to survive, and the ones that are shorter die off, and so the naturally taller ones pass their genes on. And this is more accurate because every population has random variations in their genetics, and those genetic traits are able to be passed on. So Lamarck was incorrect because he didn't take into account genetics. Darwin is correct because he's taking into account the genetic variability. So moving on to Darwin's theory of natural selection. As a child, Darwin was fascinated with the natural world and an avid collector. He attended college he liked lectures on geology and biology. Botanist John Henslow helped him kind of develop these skills on identification of collected plants. He worked with another guy named Adam Sedgwick, the founder of modern geology, with geology's rocks. Darwin accepted a post as a naturalist on the HMS Beagle, and this was where his studies really took off. He went on a 5-year voyage of the southern hemisphere, and really he began to kind of put things together, mostly on the Galapagos Islands. He really became famous for his finches, looking at the beaks of finches on the Galapagos Islands. So he noticed that his different finches have different beaks depending on what they ate. Now, speciation is the development of a species over time, and the finches, what he noticed was that the Galapagos Islands led to isolation, and so one bird ended up on one island, and keeping in mind birds can fly, so they could fly from island to island, but let's say there were insects on one island, and so that bird had a beak that was adapted for insects, and another bird had a beak that was adapted for fruits, and another bird that had a beak that was adapted for nuts, and each bird had a beak that was adapted for its unique situation, and it was able to, over time, have characteristics of the original finch, but change over time to have a beak that suited its particular habitat and allowed it to survive better. So there is evidence to suggest that different animals lived in different places, and he was able to use fossils to support this. Fossils of extinct mammals Darwin found during his exploration of South America. He found this example of a Glyptodon and Mylodon, so like a ground sloth and an extinct kind of armadillo-looking creature. And using biogeography as the study of geographic distribution of life forms on Earth, he was able to see that there were different animals that had similar characteristics, even though they lived in different places on Earth. So while in the Southern Hemisphere, Darwin noticed that similar-looking environments in South America and Europe had similar-looking animals. So even though it was in different parts of Earth, they had similar-looking animals. So animals had developed similar-looking traits, even though they lived in different parts. So think of large birds are a great example. Emus and ostriches and rheas. They're all large flightless birds, but they live in different continents. So an ostrich lives in Africa, an emu lives in Australia, and a rhea lives in South America. They've all developed similar characteristics, even though they live on different continents completely. But it's because they all live in similar habitats that they have developed similar characteristics. Darwin reasoned that related species could be modified according to environmental differences. So because they live in similar habitats, they're meeting the same restrictions and the same conditions, and so because they live in a lot of these same conditions, they are having the same restrictions placed on them, and so they're trying to meet the same conditions that they're in. So here's another example, the Patagonian cavy. and the European hare, similar appearances, similar characteristics, even though they live in different areas, they have the same kind of habitat, and so they eat the same kind of foods and have a lot of the same traits. So again, the Galapagos Islands, a big deal. Darwin observed the tortoise's neck length varied among the islands. He proposed that the variations in neck length was correlated with the differences in the type of vegetation found on the islands. Observed many different species of finches among the islands and found significant differences in their beaks. Ground-dwelling finches had beaks adapted to eating seeds, while tree-dwelling finches had beaks sized according to their insect prey. He speculated that they could have descended from a mainland finch species, so one finch species that came from the mainland, and their beak size adapted depending on the different type of insect or the different type of food source that they ate. Island speciation, again, is allowing that for the isolation. They were able to develop in an isolated situation because they had limited pressures put upon them. Animals that develop on an island, they don't have as many things that are influencing them, so they're able to develop in a different situation than those that are living in a larger continent. So here's an example of the tortoises, different neck lengths for different types of vegetation. Darwin believed that variation is necessary for natural selection to operate, so lots of different kinds of variation allows for a population as a whole to have a better chance of survival. Lots of different kinds of things means that as a whole, a population can survive better. Modern science now understands that both genes and environment determines the phenotype of an organism. Genetic variation can be harmful, helpful, or neutral to survival. Some things can be helpful, some things can be harmful, or it could not matter either way. Natural selection ignores the neutral variation. The beneficial mutations will increase, so the beneficial things are going to be able to be selected for and allow these things to be passed down into the population. The negative ones are going to die off. They're not going to be selected for, and they're going to die off and not reproduce. And the neutral ones, it's not going to matter so much. They're going to be not selected for and not selected against. Natural selection itself has no goal of improvement. It's just one of those things that kind of happen naturally. So here are snails that are all the same species, but you can see they have different patterns in their shells. Just natural variation in a population. So he applied the idea of Malthus that a population has restrictions on them that limit their growth, and he had the idea that if human populations have natural restrictions on them, well, animal populations have these restrictions as well. There are going to be things that restrict a population from growing out of control, such as diseases or limiting factors such as not enough resources and competition for these resources. And so if animals need to compete for resources, then only the strongest and most physically fit are going to be able to survive for these resources. And so the healthiest are going to be the ones that survive, and the healthiest are going to pass those healthy genes on to the next generation. So some individuals are going to have these favorable traits, and the favorable traits are going to be the ones that pass down. And Darwin called this ability to have more offspring differential reproductive success, and this is called fitness. So the ones with the highest fitness are the ones that are the healthiest traits, and they're the ones that are going to pass this fitness down. So having high fitness means that you have the best ability to pass this offspring down, or pass that trait down to your offspring. Fitness can be determined by many different things, but oftentimes it's based on the habitat that you live in. Maybe high fitness means the ability to run fast, or maybe high fitness means the ability to hide in your environment. Or in the case of a giraffe, high fitness means having a long neck to reach the top of the trees. Or maybe with the Galapagos finches, high fitness means having the correct beak shape in order to eat the correct type of insect. So it really plays a huge role on the environment that the animal lives in. A desert plant with genetic variation that reduces water loss is beneficial and would increase the plant's fitness. So a lot of it does have to do with the habitat that the organism is in. So an adaptation is any evolved trait that helps an organism to be more suited to its environment. Manatees, penguins, and sea turtles are not closely related, but they all have flippers which help them to move through the water. Such adaptations to specific environments result from natural selection. So they have naturally selected these traits over time. Evolution includes other processes in addition to the natural selection, but natural selection is the only process that results in adaptations to the environment. Now we could have artificial selection, and artificial selection is when we choose something that we like. There are traits that would never happen naturally in the environment, such as, we kind of talked about it already, like watermelon seeds that are absent from current watermelons. So you go to the store, you get a watermelon, doesn't have any seeds in it. That is not a normal thing. The whole point of having a watermelon is to have seeds that the animal swallows so that the seeds can be passed through the digestive system out into the environment with the feces so that it can be moved around and passed out somewhere later and grow into another watermelon plant somewhere else. There is no advantage to a plant to make a huge grow this huge fruit and not have any seeds in it. So that is something we have artificially selected for. All these different dog breeds, there's no reason to have all these different dog breeds. Those are artificially selected that we have selected for. So domestic dogs has resulted in selectively breeding wolves with particular traits. Human-controlled breeding to increase the frequency of desired traits is called artificial selection or selective breeding. Those are things that we have selectively bred for. These are things that we choose. Chinese cabbage, Brussels sprouts, all derived from a single species. Darwin surmised that if humans could create a wide variety of organisms by artificial selection, then natural selection could also produce diversity. So he kind of used the idea of artificial selection to support the idea of natural selection. He said, if humans can do it, well, why can't nature do it as well? If we can do it artificially by thinking about it, why can't nature do it without thinking about it? So just an example, artificial selection started off with a wolf. A wolf was the original form, but English Bulldog and Whippet, these are two traits that we have bred for. Another artificial selection, wild mustard has led to Chinese cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and Coimbra. Never heard of that one. So here's some Galapagos finches. The heavy beak is suited for large seeds. Warbler finch is suited for feeding on insects, and somewhat longer. This is more of a cactus. And you can see how the head is kind of removed back to avoid those needles. But Darwin surmised that they all came from the original finch, and their beaks adapted over time by natural variation within the population. So it's been a while since Darwin came up with this natural selection idea, and the problem is that it is difficult to observe these traits over time because it takes time, and it takes time to see changes in generation over generation. Generations take time, but some organisms have faster generation times than others. These observations of natural selections are ongoing. Peter and Rosemary Grant are observing natural selection as it occurs in finches on Daphne major. Their research shows that beak size of the medium ground finch adapts to the weather from generation to generation. Research by Sean Carroll and others demonstrate how new traits can evolve as a result of only a few changes in the DNA code that regulates the gene. So we are observing that natural selection is ongoing. It's easier to observe in organisms that have very fast generational turnover, where we can see multiple generations. We're seeing this in the flu with why we need to get flu shots every year, because the flu is constantly evolving. That's why we have to get a new flu shot every year, and it doesn't. We have or antibacterial resistant bacteria now, is because the antibiotics are not changing, but the bacteria are evolving. We are creating superbugs now and staph resistant things, because the antibiotics that we have are not evolving, but the bacteria themselves are evolving, because they have short generational time spans, and our medicine is not keeping up with that. So evolution is going on even within the time that we've known about it, especially for organisms that have shorter lifespans and shorter generational times. The thing is, we are not seeing it in as much in organisms that have longer generational time span, but we are seeing it to some degree. I mean, just think about humans and technology, for instance. We are seeing it in humans and how we have adapted to using technology. My generation, we didn't have cell phones and things in the classroom, and my first computer I got when I was in high school, and how we have already adapted to technology and cell phone usage and computers and laptops and like tablets and things like that. They're everywhere now, and we have adapted and we have evolved to their usage. So it is definitely going on. It is something that we are seeing, and you can deny it as much as you want, but adaptations, and now whether it creates a new species, that is still up for debate, but we are seeing changes in species. Whether it creates a new species, that's another story. So you can see evolution in the beaks of these ground finches. Again, what's up for debate is whether it's creating an entirely new species. So that comes back to something called macroevolution versus microevolution, which something isn't talked about as frequently. Microevolution is changes within a species, which is what we are seeing here. This is the same species. This has not created a new species, but we are seeing evolution within the species. Now, macroevolution is more of creation of a new species over thousands of years, and that's more of what's the controversy is surrounding. But microevolution is what we're looking at in a scale like this, and microevolution is more of what I was talking about with like the change that we're seeing in humans and technology. But the two are different. So microevolution is on a smaller scale and macroevolution is on a larger scale. So again, here's some looking at the wing spots in flies, and you can see how that has changed over time as well. Some evidence for evolutions, looking at the fossil record, you can see fossil records are their remains and traces of the past life. Traces include trails, footprints, or preserved droppings. Fossil records are the history of life from the past. You can actually look at lines in the rocks and see where different fossils stop, and use that and carbon tracing in order to date back where the rocks are and how old they are. Fossil records can indicate how old something is and help us to guess how old the fossils are. Sometimes the fossil record is complete enough to show the descent from an ancestor. Transitional fossils are a common ancestor from two different groups of organisms. They allow us to trace the descent of the organism back in time. So here's kind of an example. We can get a fairly complete skeleton sometimes, and that shows how, and it gives us like the bones of the skeleton, and sometimes we can guess, but sometimes you get a fairly good imprint of what it looks like too. Here's some other examples where we get a pretty good imprint, and we can compare that to an animal from, this is million years ago. So this is 50 million years and 40 million years, and we can compare it to a modern day ancestor. So biogeographical evidence is the distributions are consistent with the hypothesis that related forms of life evolved in one locale and then spread to accessible regions. This also can indicate like Pangea and plate tectonics, that the continent was one big continent, one supercontinent, Pangea, and that it spread over time. A different mix of plants and animals would be expected when geography separates the continents, islands, and seas. Marsupials, mammals, which were the pouches and egg-layings, today they are endemic to South America and Australia, but when there was one continent, you can see evidence that they used to be in different areas, and now they're just isolated to one area. So most of the marsupials are all located in Australia. The Tasmanian wolf, which now extinct, that resembles the American wolf. And then we've also got the Australian wombat and sugar gliders, all which are found in Australia. Anatomical evidence of evolution. If you look at the forearm of vertebrates, almost all vertebrates have a very similar forearm, no matter what kind of animal it is, whether it's a reptile or amphibian or mammal. They all have very similar like finger structures, whether it's a flipper or a wing. They all have similar bone structures. This is something that I do when I teach zoology, is we compare the anatomy. The hand, the arm, the leg, they all have a very similar structure. Darwin interpreted this as support for a hypothesis of common descent, the fact that all of the bone structure is very similar. Also, embryological development. All vertebrate embryos have a postanal tail and what are called parapharyngeal or throat pouches. The embryonic development looks very similar. If you looked at an 8-week-old human fetus and looked at an 8-week-old turtle or chicken or amphibian, they all look very similar to each other. So here you can see a whale, a cat, a horse, and a human, a bat, and a bird. All of the same bones are highlighted, so they're all pink for the humerus and all blue for the ulna and the purple for the radius. So you can see they all match up, and the phalanges are kind of the yellowy orange color, and even though they're kind of positioned in a different place, they're all located in relatively the same region. Homologous and analogous with anatomical structure. Homologous means the anatomical similar because they are inherited from a common ancestor. Analogous means they serve the same function but are not really connected the same. Also, there are vestigial organs. That means they fully developed anatomical structures in one group of organisms, but now they are obsolete. We don't need them anymore. We had them for a purpose, but now we don't need them for a purpose anymore. So again, if you compared a fetus of a like a tortoise and a chick, very, very similar. I mean, the human does kind of look different, but the younger they are, the more similar they look, and the harder they are to tell them apart. Other things is they all have the same 20 amino acids. We all have the same DNA triplet code, so called codons. DNA-based pair sequences. We all use the same adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine. Those are all the same. Very similar, suggest the common descent. A lot of similarities in just our genetic code in general. If we look at our phylogenetic tree, we can compare that back as well, and we use a lot of the same structures molecularly. Homeobox or Hox gene. They orchestrate the development of the body plan for all animals. All animals share a Hox gene common ancestor. The number and type of the Hox gene vary among animal groups. Variation in Hox gene is responsible for a wide range of body plans seen in animals. So simple changes in the gene control have profound effects on the phenotype. So this homeobox gene or the Hox gene helps to determine, we all have that Hox gene, but you change it up a little bit and it makes different changes for animals. Evolution is no longer considered a real hypothesis. It is one great unifying theory. So it's not really a hypothesis. It is more of one of those theories. It is one of those bigger theories, and it's very widely receptive. There is no real transitional fossil. Biologists don't really expect all transitional fossils to have been preserved, but have unearthed many other transitional fossils. Evolution proposes that life changed due to random events, and evolution is not observable or testable. It is not science. So these are kind of the criticisms of evolution. But evolution can be both observable and testable. So there's a lot of controversy surrounding evolution, but more and more evolution is becoming more accepted, and there is a lot of support that is surrounding evolution, and it is widely accepted by the scientific community. And again, I'm not trying to tell you what to believe. You can believe what you like, but this is what science supports. And if you don't believe it, again, it is good to know the other side of the story. There is what's called the Tree of Life Project, and it is a collaborative effort to determine how all life is related and descended from a common ancestor. It contains hundreds of species from all domains of life and is growing. It has provided support for the Darwin theory of evolution by natural selection. It's a really kind of a neat project that shows kind of the relation of different things, and it's really kind of a fun, interactive. You can go to the Tree of Life Project and look at the relationship between all the living things that they have classified and just kind of explore it and see how fungus is related to bacteria, which is related to protists, which is related to humans, which is related to, a tree or to a plant or to a horse. So it's kind of neat how many things that they've got on there and how it keeps growing too. All right, so we're going to go ahead and stop there and call it good until we get on to our next chapter. So we will see you then. Bye, everyone.